The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was hunched over my laptop in my cramped Chicago apartment, nursing my third cup of coffee and trying to make sense of quarterly reports, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number from Maine. "Is this David Chan?" The voice was gravelly, aged, with the distinctive accent of coastal New England. "Yes, this is David. Who's calling?" "Name's Harold Winters. I'm an attorney here in Millbrook, Maine. I'm calling about your grandfather, Thomas Chen." My grandfather. I hadn't spoken to him in over 5 years. Not since the awkward Christmas dinner where he'd rambled about lights in the ocean and ships that shouldn't be there. My parents had written it off as early dementia, but something about his intensity that night had unsettled me. After that, our family's contact with him had dwindled to obligatory birthday cards. Is everything all right?" I asked, though the formal tone of the lawyer's voice already suggested the answer. "I'm sorry to inform you that your grandfather passed away 3 weeks ago. Natural causes, in his sleep. He was 89. The news hit me harder than I expected. Guilt washed over me as I realized I hadn't even known he was sick. We didn't know. No one contacted us. That's partly why I'm calling." Thomas was quite specific about his final wishes. He left instructions that no one was to be notified until after his affairs were settled. He was always a private man, kept to himself mostly. "I see." I set down my coffee, trying to process this. "What can I do for you, Mr. Winters?" "Well, that's the interesting part. Your grandfather left you something in his will. The lighthouse." "I'm sorry, what lighthouse?" "Beacon Point Light Station. It's been in your family for 3 generations. Your grandfather was the keeper there for over 40 years, according to his will. It now belongs to you, along with the keeper's house and about 2 acres of land on the point." I stared out my apartment window at the gray Chicago skyline, trying to wrap my head around this. "Mr. Winters, I don't know anything about lighthouses. I work in accounting. I live in a city. I understand this is unexpected, but your grandfather was quite insistent. The will states that if you decline the inheritance, the property is to be sold and the proceeds donated to charity. He seemed to think you might want to continue the family tradition." Family tradition? I barely knew what that meant when it came to my grandfather. He'd always been this distant figure, more myth than man in our family stories. My father had left Maine when he was 18 and never looked back, always saying there was nothing for him there but rocks and fog. How much time do I have to decide? Well, that's another peculiarity. The lighthouse is still operational. It's automated now, but it needs someone to maintain it. The Coast Guard has been handling things temporarily, but they need a permanent solution soon. There's also the matter of the keeper's quarters. Your grandfather lived there until the end. I found myself asking, what's the property worth? Hard to say exactly. Lighthouse properties are unique, but the land alone, being right on the coast, is probably worth several $100,000. The lighthouse itself is historically significant. Built in 1847, some of these old light stations have sold for over $1 million to private buyers who convert them. $1 million. That was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. My accounting job barely covered my student loans and rent, but something nagged at me about the whole situation. "Mr. Winters, why me? I have cousins, other relatives. Why?" "Not my father." There was a pause on the other end. "Your grandfather was specific about that too. He said you were the only one who might understand. He left you a letter explaining his decision. I can mail it to you, well, I could give it to you in person if you decide to come see the property. Might be worth a trip, even if you decide to sell. You should see what you're inheriting." I looked around my dingy apartment, at the stack of bills on my kitchen counter, at the job that was slowly crushing my soul. What did I have to lose? "All right, Mr. Winters, I'll come take a look." 3 days later, I was driving a rental car up the Maine coast on Route 1, watching the landscape grow increasingly rugged and remote. The GPS guided me off the main highway onto smaller and smaller roads until I was following a narrow, winding path through dense pine forests. The smell of salt air grew stronger with each mile. Millbrook turned out to be exactly what you'd expect from a small Maine coastal town. Weathered buildings, a tiny harbor filled with lobster boats, and the kind of general store that sold everything from fishing tackle to homemade pie. I found Harold Winter's law office above the post office, a cramped space that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. Winters himself was a thin man in his 70s, with wild white hair and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted me with a firm handshake and immediately began pulling papers from filing cabinets. "Good of you to come, David. I have to say, you look quite a bit like your grandfather did at your age. Same dark hair, same serious expression." He handed me a thick manila envelope. "These are the property deeds, maintenance records, and your grandfather's letter. The keys are in there too." I hefted the envelope, surprised by its weight. "How do I get to the lighthouse from here?" "Continue on the coast road for about 8 miles. You'll see a sign for Beacon Point. The road gets pretty rough toward the end. Your grandfather never bothered to have it properly paved. The lighthouse is right at the end of the point. You can't miss it." As I stood to leave, Winters caught my arm. "David, I feel I should mention, your grandfather was, well, he had some unusual ideas about that lighthouse in his later years. The townspeople respected him, but they thought he'd gotten a bit eccentric. Don't let that color your judgment of the property. It's a beautiful place, and the lighthouse is in excellent condition." "What kind of unusual ideas?" Winters hesitated. He became very particular about the light schedule. "The lighthouse is automated now, runs on a timer system, but Thomas was always fiddling with it. He'd call me at all hours, insisting that the light needed to be turned off at specific times. The Coast Guard tried to work with him, but he shrugged. Like I said, don't let it influence your decision." The man was 89 years old. I thanked him and headed back to my car, the envelope of documents on the passenger seat like a weight of responsibility I wasn't sure I wanted to carry. The drive to Beacon Point was spectacular and slightly terrifying. The road clung to cliff tops that dropped away to crashing waves below, and the pine forests grew so thick in places that they blocked out the afternoon sun. I passed maybe 3 other cars the entire 8 miles, and no houses at all once I left the main road. The sign for Beacon Point was weather-beaten and partially obscured by overgrown brush, but I spotted it and turned onto what could generously be called a driveway. The track was indeed rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, winding through dense woods for what felt like forever before finally opening onto a stunning vista. The lighthouse stood at the very tip of a rocky promontory, its white tower stark against the gray March sky. It was taller than I'd expected, maybe 60 feet high, with a red roof on the lantern room at the top. Next to it sat a modest 2-story house, painted white with green shutters, connected to the lighthouse by a covered walkway. I parked next to the house and stepped out into the wind. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was constant and powerful, punctuated by the cries of seabirds circling overhead. The air was cold and clean, carrying the sharp scent of salt and seaweed. The house key fit easily into the front door lock, but the door itself was swollen with moisture and required a good shove to open. I stepped into what had been my grandfather's home for decades, and was immediately struck by how well preserved everything was. The rooms were clean and tidy, as if he'd just stepped out for a walk. The front room was simple but comfortable, with a wood-burning stove, a worn leather armchair, and walls lined with maritime charts and photographs of ships. A large window looked out toward the ocean, offering a view that stretched to the horizon. I could see why someone might want to live here, despite the isolation. I made my way through the house, taking inventory. The kitchen was small but functional, with modern appliances that looked recently installed. The upstairs held 2 bedrooms, one of which had clearly been my grandfather's. The bed was neatly made, and personal items were arranged on the dresser. The other bedroom was set up as an office, with a desk, filing cabinets, and shelves lined with books about navigation, weather, and lighthouse maintenance. It was in the office that I found the logbooks. They were lined up on one shelf labeled by year, going back to 1982. I pulled out the most recent one and flipped it open. My grandfather's handwriting was cramped but legible, documenting daily weather conditions, ship sightings, and maintenance tasks. But as I read through the entries, I began to notice odd patterns. March 15th, light extinguished 11:47 p.m., restored 3:23 a.m., no incidents. March 22nd, light extinguished 11:15 p.m., restored for 45 a.m., fog bank cleared by dawn. April 3rd, light extinguished 10:58 p.m., restored to 17 a.m. They were close to night. They were close to night. I flipped back through more pages, finding similar entries scattered throughout. Sometimes, the light would be turned off for just a few minutes, other times for hours, and always, there were these cryptic notes about incidents or what kind of concerns. The light was being turned off irregularly, sometimes for hours at a time. We'd get calls from ships reporting that Beacon Point was dark when it should have been operational. When we'd come check, your grandfather would have some explanation about maintenance or weather conditions, but he shrugged. The equipment logs didn't always match his story. I thought about the logbook entries I'd just been reading. Did you ever figure out what was really happening? Not exactly. The lighthouse is automated now. Has been since the late 90s. The light runs on a timer system and GPS coordinates. It should turn on at sunset and off at sunrise automatically. But somehow, your grandfather had figured out how to override the system. He'd installed his own manual controls. Webb walked toward the lighthouse, and I followed. The base of the tower was accessible through a heavy wooden door, which he unlocked with a key from his ring. We've been maintaining the lights since your grandfather passed, but we need to get this sorted out. If you're planning to keep the property, you'll need to take responsibility for proper operation. If you're going to sell, we need to know so. We can make other arrangements. Inside the lighthouse, a spiral staircase wound up to the center of the tower. Webb started climbing, and I followed, my legs burning by the time we reached the top. The lantern room was a small circular space, surrounded by the massive Fresnel lens that focused the lighthouse beam. The equipment was more complex than I'd expected. Computer controls, GPS units, weather monitoring devices, and what looked like a ham radio setup. This is all the original lens assembly, Webb explained, gesturing to the enormous glass structure. Third-order Fresnel lens, installed in 1847. It's a work of art, really. The light itself is LED now, much more efficient than the old incandescent bulbs. He showed me the control panel, which looked like something from a spacecraft. The automated system is pretty straightforward. Light comes on at sunset, goes off at sunrise, adjusted for seasonal changes, but your grandfather installed this. He pointed to a separate control box with manual switches. He could override the automatic system anytime he wanted. Did he ever explain why he needed to do that? Webb's expression grew uncomfortable. He had theories about shipping patterns, weather conditions, things like that. Said there were times when the light did more harm than good. Honestly, toward the end, I think the isolation got to him. Happens to lighthouse keepers sometimes. I nodded. But I was thinking about those logbook entries. The careful documentation of when the light was turned off and on didn't sound like the random actions of someone losing his grip on reality. After Webb left, I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property. The lighthouse sat on about 2 acres of rocky ground at the very tip of the point, with the ocean on 3 sides. A path led down to a small beach where waves crashed against granite boulders. The isolation was complete. I couldn't see another building in any direction that as evening approached. I decided to stay the night. I found sheets and towels in the house, and there was plenty of canned food in the pantry. I built a fire in the wood stove and settled into my grandfather's armchair with his letter, which I'd been putting off reading. The envelope was thick, containing several pages of handwritten text. My grandfather's handwriting was shaky, but clear. David, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably wondering why I left you this place. The truth is, you're the only one in the family who might understand what I'm about to tell you. I remember that Christmas dinner when you were in college. How you listened when I tried to explain about the lights in the water. Everyone else thought I was losing my mind, but you were paying attention. I've been the keeper of Beacon Point Light for 43 years. In all that time, I've learned things about this place that aren't in any Coast Guard manual or navigation chart. There are patterns in the ocean here, David. Things that most people can't see or won't believe. The lighthouse isn't just a navigation aid. It's a beacon, yes, but not just for the ships we want to guide safely to shore. There are other things. In these waters, things that are drawn to the light, and sometimes, for the safety of everyone involved, that light needs to be turned off. I know how this sounds. I know what people in town think about the crazy old lighthouse keeper who talks to himself and shuts off the light at random times. But it's not random, David. There's a pattern, and I've spent decades learning to recognize it. Check the logbooks. Check the weather data. Check the shipping records from the Coast Guard station. You'll see what I mean if you know how to look. The house is yours, and so is the responsibility that comes with it. You don't have to accept it. You can sell the property and walk away. But if you decide to stay, if you decide to be the keeper, then you need to understand what that really means. Watch the water, David. Watch for the lights beneath the waves, and when you see them, turn off the beacon, no matter what the Coast Guard says, no matter what the shipping companies demand. You turn off that light and you keep it off until they're gone. I hope you'll understand someday why I chose you for this. You have the family gift, the ability to see things others can't. Your father had it too, but he ran from it. I hope you're braver than he was. The manual override controls are hidden behind the false panel in the radio cabinet. The combination is your birth year. All my documentation is in the locked filing cabinet in the office. Same combination. Be careful, David. And remember, the light is not always a blessing. Your grandfather, Thomas Cheney, read the letter twice, then sat staring into the fire outside. I could hear the automated lighthouse beginning its nightly cycle. The powerful beam sweeping across the dark ocean every 10 seconds. The sound was hypnotic, a low electric hum punctuated by the mechanical rotation of the lens assembly. I was exhausted from the long day, but sleep felt impossible. My grandfather's words kept echoing in my mind, things that are drawn to the light and lights. Beneath the waves, it sounded like the ravings of an isolated old man. But something about the careful documentation in those logbooks suggested otherwise. I decided to check the filing cabinet he'd mentioned. The combination, my birth year, 1987, opened it. Easily, inside were dozens of folders, meticulously organized. Weather records going back decades. Ship manifests and Coast Guard incident reports. And something labeled anomalous sightings that made my pulse quicken. The anomalous sightings file was thick, filled with detailed reports in my grandfather's handwriting. Each entry was dated and included weather conditions, moon phase, and ocean state, but the descriptions were unlike anything I'd expected. November 15th, 1998. Lights observed moving information beneath surface, approximately 200 yards northeast of point. Counted at least 12 distinct sources, blue-white in color, moving at estimated 15 knots in figure-8 pattern. Light extinguished 11:45 p.m. Lights departed to southeast at 17 a.m. March 22nd, 2003. Single large light source directly below lighthouse beam. Light pulsed in regular interval, approximately every 8 seconds. Appeared to be responding to lighthouse rotation. Beacon extinguished immediately. Underwater light continued pulsing for 47 minutes before departing northeast. July 4, 2010. Multiple lights in synchronized pattern, ranged in perfect grid formation. Estimated 30-plus individual sources covering area of approximately 500 square yards. Grid rotated slowly clockwise while maintaining formation. Lights appeared to be rising toward surface. Beacon extinguished 10:33 p.m. Grid formation dissolved at 1:15 a.m. The reports went on for pages, spanning over 20 years. Each incident followed a similar pattern, strange lights in the water. My grandfather turning off the lighthouse, and the lights eventually departing. But what chilled me most were the entries where he noted what happened when he didn't turn off the light in time. October 13th, 2005, failed to extinguish beacon quickly enough. Lights approach within 50 yards of shore. Observed multiple humanoid figures on rocks below lighthouse. Counted at least 6 individuals, though difficult to determine exact number due to unusual movement patterns. Figures appeared to be attempting to reach lighthouse base. Beacon extinguished 11:58 p.m. Figures retreated to water by 12:23 a.m. No physical evidence found at sunrise, but several large rocks displaced from normal positions. I closed the file, my hands shaking slightly. Either my grandfather had been severely delusional, or I'd inherited something far more complex than just a lighthouse. I decided to try to get some sleep and deal with everything in the morning. But as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the constant sound of waves and the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam, I found myself straining to hear anything unusual. Every creak of the old house, every change in the wind, made me tense. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed the change in the lighthouse's rhythm. The beam had been sweeping past the bedroom window every 10 seconds like clockwork, but suddenly there was a longer pause, then another. I got up and looked out the window toward the ocean. The lighthouse beam was still rotating, but there was something wrong with the light itself. Instead of the steady, brilliant white beam I'd observed earlier, the light seemed to be flickering, not the regular pattern of a rotating beacon, but an irregular strobing that made my eyes water. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. The night air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of seaweed and something else, something organic and slightly rotten. The lighthouse beam continued its erratic flickering as I walked toward the tower. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The ocean surface near the lighthouse appeared to be glowing, with a faint blue-green phosphorescence, which wasn't uncommon in these waters, but as I watched, the glow began to organize itself into distinct points of light beneath the waves. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in complex geometric patterns that shifted and rotated like some vast underwater constellation. The lights pulsed in synchronized rhythms, creating waves of luminescence that rolled across the dark water. I stood transfixed, trying to process what I was seeing. The lights were clearly artificial, too organized, too purposeful to be any kind of natural phenomenon, and they were responding to the lighthouse beam. Every time the flickering light swept across the water, the underwater formation would pulse brighter, as if acknowledging the signal. My grandfather's words came back to me. There are other things in these waters, things that are drawn to the light. I ran for the lighthouse, my heart pounding. The door was still unlocked from earlier, and I took the spiral stairs to it. My breath coming in gasps by the time I reached the lantern room. The control panel was exactly as Webb had shown me, but I could see that someone, or something, had been manipulating the settings. The automated timer had been overridden, and the light was now operating on a manual control that pulsed in a specific pattern. I looked for the manual override system my grandfather had mentioned. Finding the false panel in the radio cabinet, the combination worked, revealing a separate control system with handwritten labels: emergency shutdown, manual override, and pattern recognition. Pattern recognition. The lights below were following a pattern, and somehow the lighthouse was responding to them. I could see the underwater lights clearly from the lantern room window. They had moved closer to shore, their formations more complex and urgent. And there was something else, shapes moving through the water between the lights, too large and too purposeful to be fish. My hands shook as I reached for the emergency shutdown switch. The moment I threw it, the lighthouse beam died, plunging the point into darkness. Below, the underwater lights continued their pulsing patterns for several more minutes, then gradually began to fade and disperse. I stayed in the lantern room until dawn, watching the ocean return to normal. As the first light of sunrise crept across the water, there was no sign that anything unusual had happened, just the endless rhythm of waves against rocks and the cry of seabirds beginning their morning hunt. But when I finally went back to the house, I found something that made my blood run cold. Wet footprints on the porch, not human footprints. These were longer, narrower, with what looked like webbing between elongated toes. The prints led from the direction of the rocky shore to the front door, where they stopped. Whatever had made those prints had stood on my grandfather's porch for some time. The puddles were substantial, and there were smaller drip marks scattered around, as if something had been waiting there, watching the house. I checked the door and windows, but everything was still locked. The prints led only to the porch, not away from it, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished from that spot. I spent the rest of the morning reading through more of my grandfather's files, trying to understand what I'd witnessed. The pattern became clearer as I studied his records. The underwater lights appeared regularly, usually during specific moon phases and weather conditions. They seemed to be attracted to the lighthouse beam, but if the light was extinguished quickly enough, they would eventually retreat. The few times my grandfather had failed to turn off the light in time, or hadn't been there to do so, things had come ashore. The descriptions were fragmentary and hard to believe, but they were consistent across multiple incidents spanning decades. By noon, I'd made my decision about the lighthouse. I wasn't ready to accept my grandfather's explanation of what I'd seen, but I also couldn't ignore the evidence of my own eyes. If there was even a chance that he was right, I couldn't risk selling the property to someone who didn't understand the responsibility that came with it. I called Harold Winters and told him I was keeping the lighthouse. Then I called my supervisor in Chicago and gave my 2 weeks' notice. I had enough savings to last a few months. While I figured out what to do next, over the following weeks, I settled into a routine at Beacon Point. I learned the mechanical systems of the lighthouse, studied my grandfather's documentation, and began keeping my own log of observations. Most nights were quiet, with the automated light system functioning normally, but about once a week usually, when the moon was dark or nearly so, the underwater lights would appear. I developed a system for monitoring them. My grandfather had installed several cameras around the property, and I upgraded them with night vision capabilities. I also set up motion sensors on the beach and around the lighthouse base. When the lights appeared, I would shut down the beacon immediately and document everything I could observe. The patterns became clearer with time. The lights always appeared in organized formations, sometimes grids, sometimes spirals, sometimes complex geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. They would pulse in synchronized rhythms, and the formations would rotate and shift as if controlled by some vast intelligence. More disturbing were the shapes I began to see moving between the lights. At first, I thought they might be whales or other large marine animals, but their movements were too purposeful, too coordinated. They seemed to be working together, following the light patterns like some kind of underwater choreography. And sometimes, when I was too slow to turn off the lighthouse, things would come to the surface. The first time I saw one clearly was in late April. I'd been monitoring a particularly active formation of lights when I noticed movement on the rocks below the lighthouse. Through the night vision camera, I could see a figure climbing up from the water onto the granite ledges. It was roughly humanoid in shape but wrong in every detail, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its skin appeared to be smooth and dark, almost like wet rubber, and it moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. The figure stood on the rocks for several minutes, its head tilted up toward the lighthouse beam. Then it began to climb, using handholds in the granite that I hadn't even noticed were there. It moved quickly and silently, covering ground that would have been treacherous for a human being. I shut down the lighthouse immediately and watched through the cameras. As the figure paused in its climb, for a long moment, it remained motionless, clinging to the rock face. Then, slowly, it began to descend back toward the water. By the time it reached the waves, the underwater lights had begun to fade, and within minutes, both the figure and the lights were gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Instead, I went through my grandfather's files again, looking for any mention of the climbing figures. I found several references, always brief and matter-of-fact, as if he'd grown accustomed to such encounters. They're curious about the light source, never aggressive unless the beacon remains active too long, seem to be testing our responses. Important to extinguish immediately upon sighting. Our responses. My grandfather had written about them as if they were intelligent, as if there was some kind of communication or negotiation happening. I decided I needed to learn more about the history of the area. I drove into Millbrook and spent a day at the small local library, researching everything I could find about Beacon Point and the surrounding waters. What I found was disturbing. Ship disappearances in the area went back to the earliest colonial records. Native American tribes had avoided this stretch of coast, calling it the Watching Waters in their oral histories. And there were persistent stories among local fishermen about strange lights and sea people that supposedly lived in the deep waters off the point. Most telling were the lighthouse keeper records. Beacon Point had a history of keepers who either disappeared or left suddenly, often after reporting equipment malfunctions or unusual sightings. My grandfather had been the longest-serving keeper in the lighthouse's history, and the records suggested he'd been the first to develop a system for managing the anomalous incidents. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henley, was helpful but grew noticeably uncomfortable when I mentioned Beacon Point specifically. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said, "but that place has always been difficult. The town learned to leave him alone to handle things his way. It seemed to work out for everyone." "What do you mean, it worked out?" She glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. "Before your grandfather figured out his system, we used to lose boats, fishing vessels, pleasure craft, even a Coast Guard cutter back in the 70s. Ships would be fine one day, then just. My grandfather hadn't just been protecting the lighthouse from whatever was in the water. He'd been protecting the ships from something that used the lighthouse beam to lure them into danger. The full horror of my inheritance was beginning to sink in. I wasn't just the keeper of a lighthouse. I was the guardian of some kind of ancient territorial boundary. And if I failed in that responsibility, people would die. The test came sooner than I expected. It was a foggy night in early May when I received a radio call from the Coast Guard. A pleasure yacht had broken down about 5 miles southeast of the point and was drifting toward shore. They were requesting that I maintain the lighthouse beam to help guide their rescue boat to the vessel. I was monitoring the waters through my cameras when the call came in. The underwater lights had been active for about an hour, ranged in one of their complex spiral formations. I'd already shut down the lighthouse beam, and the lights were showing signs of beginning to disperse. "Beacon Point, this is Coast Guard Station Millbrook," the radio crackled. "We need you to activate your beacon immediately. We have a vessel in distress in your vicinity." I stared at the radio, my mouth dry. The protocol was clear: lighthouse keepers were required to cooperate with all Coast Guard rescue operations. But the underwater lights were still active, and I could see shapes moving between them, larger than usual and more agitated. "Coast Guard, this is Beacon Point. I'm having technical difficulties with the light system. Can you provide the vessel's exact coordinates? Beacon Point, we need that light operational now. The yacht is taking on water, and our rescue boat is having trouble locating them in the fog." Through my cameras, I could see the underwater formation beginning to reorganize itself. The spiral pattern was collapsing into a tight cluster directly below the lighthouse. Whatever was down there was preparing for something. I made a decision that I knew I might regret for the rest of my life. "Coast Guard, my light system is completely down. I cannot activate the beacon at this time." The radio was silent for a long moment. Then, "Beacon Point, are you refusing to activate your navigation aid?" "Negative." "Coast Guard, I have a complete electrical failure. The light is not operational." It was a lie that could cost me the lighthouse, criminal charges, and possibly the lives of the people on that yacht. But I was looking at something in the water that defied explanation, and my grandfather's warnings echoed in my mind. The Coast Guard rescue took 3 hours. I monitored their radio traffic, listening to the increasingly frantic calls as they searched for the disabled yacht. In the thick fog, several times they requested that I activate the lighthouse, and each time I maintained that the system was down. Finally, just after midnight, I heard the call that the yacht had been located and its crew rescued. The relief in the Coast Guard operator's voice was unmistakable, but so was the suspicion when they signed off with "Beacon Point. We'll be sending a technical team to inspect your light system tomorrow morning." I spent the rest of the night preparing for that inspection. I had to create evidence of an electrical failure that would explain why the lighthouse couldn't be activated. It meant damaging some expensive equipment, but I had no choice. By the time the Coast Guard technicians arrived the next morning, I had created a convincing story about a power surge that had fried several critical components. They spent hours checking the systems, and while they were clearly suspicious about the timing, they couldn't prove that the failure hadn't been genuine. These old systems can be unpredictable. The lead technician admitted as they prepared to leave. "We'll have replacement parts shipped up from Boston. Should have you operational again within a week." "A week?" That would give me time to figure out how to handle future emergencies. But I was beginning to realize that this wasn't a problem I could solve alone. That afternoon, I drove into town and sought out the oldest fishermen I could find. If the local maritime community had learned to avoid the point during certain conditions, they might be willing to share their knowledge with the new lighthouse keeper. I found what I was looking for at Murphy's Bait and Tackle, a weathered shack near the harbor where the old-timers gathered to swap stories and complain about the weather. The owner, a grizzled man named Frank Murphy, greeted me with curious recognition. "You're Tom Chen's grandson," he said. It wasn't a question. "Heard you inherited the point." "That's right. I'm trying to learn about the area, understand the local conditions." Murphy and the other men in the shop exchanged glances. One of them, a man with arms covered in nautical tattoos, spoke up. "Your grandfather was a good keeper, kept the waters safe for 40 years. Safe from what?" Another long pause. Then Murphy sighed and gestured for me to follow him to the back of the shop, away from the other customers. "Look, son, I don't know what your grandfather told you about that place, but there are things in these waters that most people don't want to believe in. Your grandfather understood that. He knew when to turn off that light. The Coast Guard doesn't see it that way." Murphy snorted. "The Coast Guard thinks they understand everything because they have charts and computers, but they don't fish these waters every day. They don't know the signs." "What signs?" "Water temperature drops, fish behavior changes, and the phosphorescence when you see those blue-green lights in the water. Organized like they're not natural. That's when you stay away from the point." I felt a surge of validation. These men had seen the same things I'd been observing. "Have you ever seen anything else besides the lights?" Murphy's expression grew grim. "Once, I was young, maybe 25, and I didn't listen to my father's warnings about the point. Went out on a night when the lights were active. Thought I could catch some of those big cod that feed near the rocks." He was quiet for a moment, staring out toward the harbor. "I saw things in the water that night, swimming around my boat, close enough to touch. They looked almost human, but wrong. Like someone had tried to make a person out of clay and got the proportions all wrong." "What did you do?" "Cut my engine, doused my lights, and drifted until they lost interest. Took me 6 hours to get back to shore. I never fished near the point again, and I made sure my sons knew to stay away too." He looked at me intently. "Your grandfather kept them from coming ashore. Whatever arrangement he had with them, it worked. The town's been safe for decades because of him." "Arrangement?" "The light goes off when they're active. Simple as that. They get to do whatever they do in their waters, and they leave our boats alone. But if that light stays on," he shook his head, "bad things happen." That evening, I sat in my grandfather's chair, reading through more of his documentation. I found a file I'd missed before, labeled communication attempts. Inside were records of experiments he'd conducted, trying to establish more direct contact with whatever lived in the waters around the point. The early entries were tentative, describing how he'd used the lighthouse beam to flash simple patterns, Morse code, mathematical sequences, basic geometric shapes. For months, there had been no response. Then, gradually, the underwater lights had begun to echo his patterns. The communication had evolved over years. My grandfather had developed a simple code system, specific light patterns that meant safe, danger, stay away, and all clear. The underwater lights had learned to respond with their own patterns, creating a primitive but effective dialogue. The most recent entries in the file were the most disturbing. March 15th. Usual spring emergence pattern. Used standard stay clear. Signal. Response was immediate and compliant, but noted increased agitation and formation patterns. They're becoming less patient with the arrangement. April 2nd. Attempted extended communication session. They seem to be trying to convey information about changes in their territory. Ocean temperatures rising. Food sources shifting. They may be under pressure to expand their hunting grounds. April 18th. Emergency encounter. Large formation approached. Surfaced during commercial fishing vessel passage. Required extended shutdown of beacon to prevent incident. They're definitely becoming more aggressive. The old agreements may not hold much longer. The old agreements. My grandfather had written as if there were actual treaties or negotiations involved. But his final entry was the most chilling. May 1st. They've been testing the boundaries more frequently, coming closer to shore, staying longer near the surface. I think they're evaluating whether I'm still capable of maintaining the arrangement. When I'm gone, the new keeper will need to establish their own relationship with them. I pray David will understand what needs to be done. I was beginning to understand. The underwater lights weren't just random phenomena. They were intelligence, possibly even a civilization. And my grandfather had spent 40 years serving as a kind of ambassador between their world and ours. The Coast Guard technicians returned the following week with replacement parts for the Lighthouse. I watched nervously as they installed new control systems, hoping they wouldn't notice the manual override equipment my grandfather had installed. Fortunately, they seemed focused only on restoring the automated functions. Should be good as new, the lead technician said as they tested the system. The light will come on automatically at sunset tonight. I tried to remember my grandfather's communication system. Simple light patterns, on and off sequences that conveyed basic meanings. I began with what his notes had indicated was the safe signal. 3 short flashes, followed by a pause. Then 3 more. The response was immediate. The humming stopped, and the figures below began to emit their own light patterns. Bioluminescent patches on their skin pulsed in coordinated sequences, creating a visual language that was both beautiful and incomprehensible. For the next hour, I attempted to communicate using my grandfather's simple code system, but it quickly became clear that they were trying to convey something far more complex than the basic signals he'd established. Their light patterns were intricate, mathematical, almost like a combination of music and geometry made visible. Gradually, I began to understand fragments of their message. They were showing me images, patterns that represented the coastline, the ocean depths, the movement of ships, and running through it all was a sense of urgency, of change, of time running out. They were trying to tell me that the old arrangements were no longer sufficient. Something had changed in their world, and they needed to modify the agreement. As dawn approached, the figures began to retreat toward the water. But before they left, one of them, larger than the others, with more elaborate bioluminescent patterns, approached the lighthouse base directly. It stood in clear view of my cameras and began a final sequence of light pulses. The message was unmistakable. They would return, soon, and next time. They expected a more sophisticated form of communication. After they disappeared beneath the waves, I spent the rest of the day researching everything I could find about bioluminescent communication in marine species. If I was going to serve as the new ambassador between worlds, I needed to understand their language. I also began making preparations for their return. I installed additional cameras with better resolution, set up equipment to record and analyze their light patterns, and began experimenting with programmable lead arrays that could replicate their complex signals. Most importantly, I started documenting everything for whoever might inherit this responsibility after me. If my grandfather's experience was any guide, the arrangement with the sea dwellers would need to evolve with each new keeper. The next encounter came a week later, and it was clear that they had been preparing as well. The formation that emerged from the depths was unlike anything in my grandfather's records, organized into precise geometric shapes that conveyed complex information. Through their positioning and movement. Using the lead arrays I'd set up, I began to respond to their signals. The communication was slow and frustrating, like trying to learn a language that combined mathematics, music, and visual art. But gradually, patterns began to emerge. They were showing me their world, vast underwater cities, deep ocean territories, populations that numbered in the millions. And they were showing me the changes that threatened them: rising water temperatures, acidification, pollution, and the increasing encroachment of human activities into their domain. The lighthouse had been more than just a navigation aid to them. It had been a symbol of the boundary between their world and ours, and the agreement that kept those worlds in balance. But the boundaries were shifting, and new agreements were needed. Over the following months, I learned to communicate with them in their complex visual language. They taught me about ocean currents and weather patterns that weren't in any human meteorological database. They showed me underwater topography that revealed why certain areas were dangerous to ships, not because of rocks or reefs, but because of their own territorial boundaries. In exchange, I provided them with information about human shipping schedules, naval exercises, and offshore construction projects. We developed a system for coordinating safe passage through their waters, ensuring that ships could navigate safely while respecting their territorial claims. The arrangement worked, but it required constant vigilance. I found myself functioning as both lighthouse keeper and diplomat, mediating between two species that most people didn't even know coexisted. The Coast Guard still suspected that something unusual was happening at Beacon Point, but they couldn't prove anything. As long as the lighthouse operated normally most of the time, and ship traffic in the area remained safe, they seemed willing to let sleeping dogs lie. But the isolation was taking its toll. I'd been living alone at the lighthouse for 8 months, with only the sea dwellers for company. The few friends I'd made in Millbrook knew better than to ask too many questions about my work, but I could see the concern in their eyes. I was becoming like my grandfather, the eccentric lighthouse keeper who talked to himself and had strange theories about the ocean. The crisis came in late winter. During one of the worst storms in decades, a container ship had lost power and was drifting toward the rocks near Beacon Point. The Coast Guard had launched a rescue operation, but the storm made it impossible for their boats to reach the vessel. The ship was carrying a cargo of chemicals that would devastate the marine ecosystem if it broke up on the rocks. Worse, it was drifting directly through the heart of the sea dwellers' territory during one of their most important seasonal gatherings. I watched through my instruments as the underwater city came alive with activity. Thousands of lights pulsed in complex patterns, and I could see massive shapes moving through the depths, creatures far larger than the humanoid figures I'd been communicating with. The ship's distress calls were becoming more desperate. The crew was preparing to abandon the vessel, but the lifeboats would never survive the storm. And if the ship broke up on the rocks, the chemical spill would poison the waters for miles around. I made a decision that went against every protocol I'd been taught. I activated the lighthouse beam at full power and began signaling to the sea dwellers. Using the most urgent patterns they'd taught me, I was asking them to help save the ship. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The water around the drifting container ship began to glow with bioluminescent activity. Through the storm, I could see shapes moving beneath the vessel, massive forms that dwarfed even the largest whales. What happened next defied every law of physics I thought I understood. The ship, which had been drifting helplessly toward the rocks, suddenly began to move away from shore, not turning or rotating, but sliding laterally through the water as if pushed by an invisible force. The Coast Guard radio traffic was frantic. Container vessel North Star, are you under power? Repeat, are you under power? Negative. Coast Guard, we have no engine power, but we're moving away from the rocks. We don't understand what's happening. I watched through my cameras as the ship was gently but firmly guided into deeper water, away from both the rocky coast and the main concentration of underwater activity. The sea dwellers were using their own abilities to prevent a disaster that would have affected both species. Once the ship was in safe water, the Coast Guard was able to reach it with their rescue boats. The crew was evacuated safely, and the vessel was eventually towed to port without incident. The chemical cargo remained secure, and the marine ecosystem was protected. But I knew there would be consequences for what I'd done. Using the lighthouse to coordinate with the sea dwellers was a violation of every regulation and protocol governing lighthouse operations. If anyone discovered what had really happened, I would lose the lighthouse, face criminal charges, and probably end up in a psychiatric facility. The investigation began within days. Coast Guard officials, maritime safety inspectors, and representatives from the shipping company all wanted to know how a powerless vessel had moved against the wind and current. The ship's GPS data showed a movement pattern that was impossible to explain using conventional physics. I maintained that I had simply operated the lighthouse normally, providing navigation assistance during the storm. The unusual movement of the ship, I claimed, must have been due to underwater currents or other natural phenomena that I wasn't qualified to explain. The officials were suspicious, but had no evidence of wrongdoing. The Lighthouse logs showed normal operation. The ship had been saved, and no environmental damage had occurred. Eventually, the incident was attributed to unusual oceanographic conditions and filed away as an unsolved mystery. But the sea dwellers knew what I had done. In their next communication session, they expressed something that I interpreted as gratitude. The patterns they showed me were warmer, more welcoming than before. I had proven that the new agreements could work, that cooperation between our species was possible. They also showed me something else: images of other coastal areas around the world where similar arrangements existed. I wasn't the only human maintaining diplomatic relations with aquatic intelligences. There was a network of lighthouse keepers, harbor masters, and coastal observers who served as intermediaries between the surface world and the depths. My grandfather had been part of that network, and now I was to dot as I write this. I've been the keeper of Beacon Point Light for 2 years. The lighthouse operates normally most of the time, guiding ships safely past the rocky coast. But several times each month, when conditions are right, I turn off the automated systems and engage in more complex communications with the beings who share these waters. The arrangement continues to evolve. We've prevented 3 major shipping disasters, coordinated the safe passage of migrating whales through busy shipping lanes, and developed protocols for managing offshore construction projects without disrupting underwater habitats. The isolation is still difficult, but I've found purpose in this strange dual existence. I'm no longer just an accountant who inherited a lighthouse. I'm a guardian of the boundary between 2 worlds, maintaining a balance that has existed for generations. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if the truth about places like Beacon Point became public knowledge. Would humanity be ready to accept that we share the planet with other intelligent species? Or would fear and misunderstanding lead to conflict and disaster? For now, the secret is safe. The network of keepers continues its quiet work, and the ancient agreements hold. But change is coming. I can see it in the increasing complexity of the sea dwellers' communications, in their growing concern about human impacts on the ocean environment. The next generation of keepers will face challenges that my grandfather never imagined. Climate change, deep-sea mining, and expanding maritime traffic are all putting pressure on the delicate balance we've maintained. But there's hope too. The sea dwellers are remarkably adaptable, and their willingness to work with humans suggests that peaceful coexistence is possible. If we can learn to listen to what they're trying to tell us, we might find solutions to problems that affect both our species. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the dark water every 10 seconds, just as it has for over a century. To passing ships, it's simply a navigation aid, marking the dangerous rocks of Beacon Point. But to those who know how to look, it's something more, a symbol of the ongoing dialogue between 2 civilizations, and a beacon of hope for the future of both. Tonight, the sea dwellers are active again. I can see their lights gathering in the depths, organizing into the complex patterns that have become as familiar to me as any human language. They have something new to show me, something important about changes in the deep ocean that could affect coastal communities around the world. I turn off the automated lighthouse system and begin to respond to their signals, taking my place in a conversation that began long before I was born and will continue long after I'm gone. This is my inheritance, my responsibility, and my privilege. The light goes out, and the real communication begins.